Hello, and welcome to episode 32 of Charlotte Mecklenburg History with Dan Morrill. Today is Sunday, November 15th, 2020, and I am Dan's daughter, Mary Dana, here with Dan through Zoom. Hey, Dad.
Hey, Mary Dana, how
Good,
are you? Hello,
good.
everybody. Hey,
And today he is going to be talking about Elizabeth Lawrence and also giving some more updates on some properties. So, right?
you ready?
I'm
Well, listen,
I'm
let me
ready.
start. Let me start out by saying that I've made the point so many times that it's so important to have a private nonprofit historic preservation group in a community if it's going to have really a robust preservation movement, and that is why it's so important to have preserved Mecklenburg, and that's why I make repeated attempts to get people to support us, both intellectually, emotionally, and financially, as we try to build that organization. And boy, is that ever illustrated by what I'm going to talk about tonight. And Dana, I think it will have some special meaning for you because it's basically going to focus on two very smart women who
What
happen
are you
to have
saying?
either the fortune or the misfortune to live most of their lives in the first half of the 20th century, and who therefore face some of the difficulties of opportunity that women had at that time. And most of the information, or a lot of the information, that I'm going to be drawing upon for these two women comes from a biography of one of those women by Emily Herring Wilson, whose name is there on the screen. And if any of you want to read this biography, it's entitled No One Gardens Alone, A Life of Elizabeth Lawrence, who is one of these two women. And I think this quotation at the top would absolutely blow a lot of people's minds who live in Charlotte, because they wouldn't understand it, and they don't appreciate it, and they don't realize it. And let me just read it to you. Together, Elizabeth Lawrence and Elizabeth and Eddie Clarkson made Ridgewood Avenue in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now listen to this. One of the most famous addresses in Southern garden history. In fact, I would go as far as to say that anyone who really is into the history of gardening, and I'm talking here basically about ornamental gardening, they know Ridgewood Avenue. They know Elizabeth Clarkson, and they know Elizabeth Lawrence. And I'm going to be talking about both those women, more on Elizabeth Lawrence than Elizabeth Clarkson, but they are both really rather, they're famous people in the history of gardening. And I'll also be talking about how historic Mecklenburg, or preserved Mecklenburg, is involved in an issue that potentially faces the garden, particularly that of Elizabeth Lawrence. Elizabeth Lawrence is the woman on the right. She was born in 1904. She died in 1985. She's buried up in Maryland, outside Baltimore, because that's where her niece lived. She never married. She never had any children. She basically was a very shy but strong person. She lived a very, very private life, a very regulated life. She once said that when she came home from college in 1926, and at that time she lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, and until she moved to Charlotte, which was in 1947, she never packed her suitcases once.
Hmm.
She often said that there are two kinds of people in the world. people who wanted to go away from home and find something to do, and those that stayed home and had plenty to do. And she definitely belonged to that latter category. She really is a extraordinary woman. Now, as far as Elizabeth Clarkson, she was from Texas. I haven't gone as deeply into her biography as I have Elizabeth Lawrence, but Elizabeth Clarkson came to Charlotte as a bride. She married Eddie Clarkson, who was a prominent businessman here. They built a house on Ridgewood Avenue in 1927, a very traditional colonial style, two-story frame house. And at that time, there were practically no houses on the street at all. And over the years, they built an extraordinary place, which is still very well known among some in Charlotte. Many people visit there. I've been there. It's known as the Winghaven Garden and Bird Sanctuary. Elizabeth Clarkson was primarily interested in birds. I can tell you, I remember one day when I met her, it must have been in the late 1970s or early 1980s. She died in 1982. And I went into her living room there on Ridgewood Avenue. And we were sitting there on a warm summer day. By the way, don't worry, the phone's ringing. We don't worry about that. We were sitting there on a warm summer day, windows wide open. And Mary Dana, while I was sitting there, this bird flew in and ate out of her hand.
Oh gosh.
And you know, being an old city boy like I was just absolutely shocked. And she and her husband both devoted their life to building this garden that I'll talk about. So essentially what I'm going to be focusing on is Elizabeth Lawrence and the garden that Elizabeth Clarkson and her husband did. Now I'm going to show you a few pictures of Winghaven, the Winghaven Garden and Sanctuary, because even though they were both well known for the gardens they created, they were very, very different gardens. Winghaven is a show garden. Now, if you think about it, let's think about these ornamental gardens. You know, we're not talking about growing radishes here. We're talking about ornamental plants.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a garden is an illusion. An illusion is something that looks real, but it's not really real. In the sense that some people would say, well, they love to go to a place like Winghaven because they love nature. This isn't nature. Nature doesn't look like this. Nature isn't clipped. Nature doesn't have straight rows. This is an illusion. It's like a puppet. You know that puppet I've got of Bert and Ernie?
Yes.
Well, that's what this is.
Yeah.
It's a Bert and Ernie. It's an illusion. And of course, Winghaven is primarily a bird sanctuary. That's what Elizabeth Clarkson and her husband really desired to create. And over the years, what they did was to buy adjacent properties and tear the houses down to where they've now created a garden of about 4 acres.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a devoted group of volunteers, and it is stunning. I mean, it is stunningly beautiful. And Elizabeth and Eddie Clarkson both would walk out to this garden, and they'd take these little clickers or little stones or whatever, and they'd kind of make a little noise with them, and these birds would come down, sit on their hand, and eat worms out of or eat seed, according to whether they were
worms.
You know, well, some birds eat worms. And they would eat them literally in little cups that they held in their hands. So, you know, and there's no question about it that Anybody, have you been to Winghaven, Mary Diane?
No, I'm ashamed to say that I have never been to
Well,
Winghaven.
you need to go. You need to go.
Are
You,
they
no, you,
open right now with
you
the
and I.
pandemic?
Yes. Well, I think, but no, they're on limited. They're not. But
Okay,
um, at least I don't think they are. Maybe they do some distancing, but I don't know,
we'll
Mary
have to
Diane.
do some research, but I know
But
I do
well,
need to
I
visit
mean,
there.
you and I'll have to go. In fact, we'll have to go to both these gardens. Now, here, look, here's their house. I mean, you can hardly see it from Ridgewood Avenue because
Yeah.
that's the house that they moved into in 1927, and it's essentially just a part of the garden. But it is an unbelievable place. But as I started out showing, I'm going to try to change pages here. So let's see it. I hope it works. I can do it. I just hold on. God will grace us. Now let's go. I want to go and look at the Emily Lawrence Garden,
You mean Elizabeth Lawrence Garden?
Elizabeth Lawrence Garden, because it's a very, very different kind of place. Um, First of all, the Elizabeth Lawrence Garden. Now, she actually had two gardens. Um, she had one that she created in Raleigh. Her mother was the person who really introduced her to gardening. Her mother was an avid gardener, and Elizabeth said that her mother went by the name Bessie,
Mm-hmm.
but she was Elizabeth too. That was just a nickname for Elizabeth. But Bessie Lawrence is the one who introduced her daughter Elizabeth to gardening. And Elizabeth said that it was when she was about 8 years old. She lived in a very small little town in the midst of a rural area near Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, called Garysburg when she was a little girl. And that's where she really started doing what she did. You think, I look, I would be less than forthcoming if I said that I was a great lover of plants. I don't know anything about plants. You know me well enough to know that I'm basically an inside guy. Last thing in the world I'd want to do is take on the responsibility of this garden. But she was passionate about it. And isn't it true that one of the secrets of really having a successful life is to be passionate about what you do? Now,
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about this garden and contrast it with what we just saw with Winghaven. First of all, this garden is much smaller. It's really just the back. Well, she put a few things in the front yard, but essentially you're looking at the back of her house, which she designed, by the way, which was built in 1947, 1948. So she came from Raleigh to Charlotte. She essentially came here because by that time her mother was becoming quite elderly and she needed her sister's help to look after their mother. And the sister lived right next door. So that's why she came. That's why she came to Charlotte. The mother bought the lot. There wasn't a house on it. They developed this house. She designed this house. And she designed it to be a place for her to work at her garden. So one thing is this garden is much, much smaller. Now, this is open to the public too. But you will find that a lot of people who go to the Elizabeth Lawrence Garden are not nearly as impressed with it as they are with Winghaven. Because as I told you in the beginning, Winghaven is a show garden.
Mm-hmm.
That means it is a garden that's to be beautiful.
Well, it's much more formal, is what
That's
I
right.
noticed, like a
And
formal
if you'll
garden.
notice here, now it's got a central axis in it. It's got a walkway down the middle. But if you'll notice here, the edges aren't really absolutely straight and clean. The plants sort of go over into the sidewalk and it kind of looks a little bit like a bramble, just a
Mm-hmm.
lot of different plants and so forth. But this was a laboratory garden. One of the things that Elizabeth Lawrence was absolutely driven by was to discover plants that were not native to this region, but could grow in the Southeast. Elizabeth, to the absolute core of her being, was a Southern lady. And she said that most of the books on gardening that were published talked about doing gardens in the North because that's where most people lived, and that's the thing the editors were all interested in, was writing books for Yankees, not for Southern gardeners.
Mm-hmm.
So she was born in Marietta, Georgia. She was born in her father's boyhood home. She was a member of the Episcopal Church, loved the Book of Common Prayer, and I can certainly identify with that because I too grew up in the Episcopal Church. And Elizabeth Clarkson, by the way, was a member of the Episcopal Church too. And Elizabeth Lawrence and Elizabeth Clarkson were good friends. They enjoyed one another. But what Elizabeth Lawrence did with this garden was to test what plants. They might come from Brazil, they might come from Portugal, they might come from China, they might come from Japan, they might come from Jamaica, they could come from anywhere in the world. Would they propagate here in North Carolina? And Elizabeth had a rare combination of gifts. Now, here, by the way, you can see this picture, which was taken in 1956, and this is Elizabeth in her garden. And what emotion, Mary Dana, would you say that what emotion in her face would you say this photograph conveys?
Joy.
Yeah, exactly. And she had a lot of struggles in her life. Her sister, that she was very close to, actually predeceased her and died of breast cancer. Her mother had a stroke in 1957 and didn't die until the mid 1960s. And Elizabeth had to spend a tremendous amount of time helping her mother. Elizabeth in later life developed arthritis rather severely, which really frustrated her. She fell several times, and I can identify with that. She fell several times in the garden in later years and hurt herself. So, I mean, she didn't live an idyllic life. But, you know, she had, and as I said, never any children, never married. But she had an absolute gift that so many people they never really have in life. And that is something that they're just completely enraptured by. And she had a rare combination of gifts, and it's rare. She got an undergraduate degree from Barnard College, Barnard in New York City, and she got a degree in English. And she also was the first woman ever to enroll in the landscape architecture program at North Carolina State. She graduated in the early 1930s. I'm going to say it was 1933. Might have been 1932, early 30s. And she had a rare combination. First of all, and it didn't come easy to her. She was an elegant writer. I mean, she wrote beautiful, beautiful prose. In fact, I looked on YouTube, and one woman said about Elizabeth Lawrence that no one ever wrote words as beautiful about gardening as she did. But she also had a wonderful scientific mind. She was extremely intelligent. And Mary, I don't ask you to agree with me or don't agree with me, but you know, I think really intelligent women, particularly understanding she was born in 1904. Extremely intelligent women can face some real challenges in life. One of the challenges she faced was that people who graduated in landscape architecture from NC State, they would do things like go to work for the highway department, or they might go work for the state parks, or they might be hired by developers or whatever. But being a woman, uh, she didn't get those job offers, and
Right.
she ended up with the fact that she came out of that program and she really didn't have a job. She did not have a job, but she was the one thing that she was a very, very introspective person. She wrote a lot of poetry. She's not going to make any money writing poetry.
Mm.
Um, she worked in that when she came home from college in 1926, when as an undergraduate. She went back and lived with her parents. And the one thing she did was start doing a garden with her mother. And they created a quite large garden. It was right off Hillsborough Street. Down there, there's a road called Park Avenue that goes off West Hillsborough, right at the NC State campus. She had a garden there. It's gone. It's totally gone now. It's been paved over, obliterated, eliminated. But she didn't have a job. She had no way to make income. And so she just started doing what she did before she went to college. That is, she just started going about doing a garden. Well, some of her friends said, "Well, Elizabeth, you got to make some money. Why don't you try to combine the two things you can do well? You can write and you can do gardens. Why don't you start writing about gardens?" And that's really what makes her the person that she ended up being. Now, I wanted to show you down here. There's a picture here, the cover of this book, and I put up here autographed copies of Southern Garden. Cost $3 when it was
Mm-hmm.
put out in 1942. This book is still in print. You can go to UNC Press and buy this book. You can go to Amazon.com and you can buy this book. This book is an absolute classic, and it's called A Southern Garden by Elizabeth Lawrence. And what she did, that's really what makes her famous. What makes her famous is not her gardening. As effective and as terrific as her gardening was, what makes her really well known are her books. She wrote many books, but by far and away the one that is the most cited was her first book, which was this book entitled A Southern Garden. And Elizabeth, her basic theory about a garden was, first of all, a garden was a year-round proposition. Her favorite time in the garden was in the winter. You ought to make a garden bloom all year long. And also, Elizabeth said you ought to try something different. You know, and what she did in this book was she gives very direct, specific instructions about how you plant these different plants, how you till the soil, what kind of soil they need, what are the fertilizers they need, what are their, and she kept meticulous records. Her daily routine, she'd go out in the garden in the morning, and this was both in Raleigh and in Charlotte. And she worked all morning in the garden, and she would do the things that people do in a garden. There's some great images here. For example, this is her in her Raleigh garden. And there she is. That's what you do in a garden. I mean, she was what they called a dirt gardener. She didn't just talk about a garden. She got down and grunged it out. She worked in the garden. She weeded the garden. She cultivated the garden. She edged the garden. She was a hands-on gardener. She would work all morning, and then in the afternoon, she would go to her study, and I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. She would go to her study and she would do things like this. She kept 3x5 note cards. She'd write down, for example, when she planted the plant, when the plant first sprouted, when the plant first bloomed, how tall it was when it bloomed. She would photograph the flower or plant in various stages of its development. And she kept these 3x5 cards and filed them away in these file drawers. And they're still there in that house. In fact, if you go to the house, that's one of the things they'll talk to you about. They'll talk about what she did. So she was a meticulous gardener. And interestingly enough, because she had this literary flair, she wouldn't just talk about the plant. She would put the plant in some sort of historical context. She would, for example, talk about, see, just some art. Go. She did things like this is in the Raleigh News and Observer, and this was right before she left Raleigh, talking about she had exotic flowers. She was not there. She is standing there looking at the flowers that are blooming. She did a lot of things for the Raleigh annual flower show. She'd make little exhibits and designs of gardens. Here is a picture of her garden in Raleigh. And she was a big believer in using stone and having different levels to a garden. So she is true. And here she is with her mother. This picture was taken in Charlotte. This is 1952. And her mother, as I said, was such a major influence in her life. And let me go back here just a minute and see if I can.
And by the way, you've been talking for almost 30 minutes.
Well, we might have to do another one on her. Well, let me ask you a question. I always ask you these questions. Have you found this interesting?
Well, yeah, I do think it's interesting.
Well, now here, let's look at. I talked about her study. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now this is you go in the house right now and you can look at and I can get a little bit more in for you.
Did you say what the address was?
I'll do that. I'm just getting ready to do it. Okay. Here's her typewriter. She could look out and see her garden, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a built-in big file drawers here. That's where she kept all those notebooks and all those 3x5 cards. And you can see some images. Okay, let me talk about the preservation issue. Maybe I ought to try to make this a little bit shorter than it would otherwise be, but I'm willing to do it. Okay, let me tell you the preservation issue and how Preserve Mecklenburg's involved. These two houses are on Ridgewood Avenue in Myers Park. People drive by these things. You know how they are, toot toot down the street, they never even look. This is 342. This is where Elizabeth's sister, younger sister, Anne, lived. Anne and her sister were very close, and they did cooperate to look after their mother. So this was Anne's house here. It is still owned by her, by Anne's children, a boy and a girl, man and a woman, or the nephew and niece of Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was very close to them, okay? 348 is the house that was designed by Elizabeth Lawrence. And if you will, I'll show you. Here's the entrance. This is by the side of the house, and I'll show you the entrance in a minute. This was in 1957 when she started writing a weekly article every Sunday in the Charlotte Observer on gardening. And they are elegantly written. Elegantly written. Now, this I took within the last month. So this is the entryway. You walk up this path to the garden. And let me go back up. I think it's up here. Yeah. Okay. Here's where you go to the garden. Here's the house. This is her house. This is 348 here. 342. Here's how you get to the garden. You just go right up there.
In between the two houses.
That's right. And that's that path. That you go up there and you go through here and you walk up here and you go to the garden back here. Okay, you got me?
Yes.
Now, let me tell you the issue that's going on here. And here's one of her articles. And I think the best way to illustrate it is just go back here. You remember how I was talking last week? In fact, I've got a page on it here as I flip around mine. We were talking about last week. We were talking about infill houses. And we were talking about what kind of impact putting a house like this can have on this house. And having a house like this can have on that house.
Right. Putting a really big house that you tear down the existing.
That's exactly the issue that we're facing with the Elizabeth Lawrence Garden. And it also is the issue that Preserve Mecklenburg might directly be involved in. And let me explain. Nothing is definite yet. Let me make straight up, but this is the issue. The time has come, and one completely understands it, Mary Dana, that the niece and nephew, neither of one who live in Charlotte, have come to the time in their life when they feel they have to sell this particular house. Now, there are three things. Now, the garden is right over here. It's right behind this house. So the garden's back here, okay? The Elizabeth Lawrence Garden. The issue is, what is it going to do to the garden if this house is torn down and you get a big house built there?
It'll block the sun to the garden.
Three things. Gardens are very, very sensitive to sunlight. You're absolutely right. And this is a south-facing house. So the eastern sun comes here. So if you put up a big house, it's going to block the sunlight. Second thing that really affects a garden that people don't think about is flow of air. Because air, of course, is so much related to pollination that the flow of air is extremely important as it moves through a garden. Well, if you put a big old house up here, it's going to alter the airflows. And the third thing that a garden is very much affected by is drainage. Now, let me say that this is not a historic landmark. It's not going to qualify to be an historic landmark. What does that mean? How my time was?
34 minutes.
Okay, I got 4 minutes. What can the Historic Landmarks Commission do with this property in terms of trying to affect what happens to it, since it's not an historic landmark? What can it do? It
Nothing.
can do nothing.
Yeah, say nothing.
Nothing. Can't do anything.
Right, nothing.
It's not in a local historic district. It's not going to be in a local historic district. What can the local historic district commission do to affect the design of whatever replaces this house? Nothing. Nothing. But what can Preserve Mecklenburg do? it can do whatever the heck it wants to do. It's not limited in any way whatsoever. Now, if you've got a nationally famous, and I would say that's true. In fact, from an academic standpoint, the Elizabeth Lawrence Garden is probably, well, there's no question it's the most important garden in Charlotte. No question about it. No question about it. I mean, there is so much knowledge that's come out of that garden, so much data that's come out of that garden, so many inspiration. She inspired so many people that come out of that garden. It's just absolutely unbelievable. So we are going to be interested. Now, there's a possibility, it's not a done deal, that Preserve Mecklenburg, for example, you remember how I talked last time about having, if you will, an exclusive assignable option to purchase.
Mm-hmm.
We could, if the owner's in agreement and if it's in the best way to proceed, and that's really a decision for Winghaven to make, we could get an exclusive assignable option. Market the property to someone that would pay the price that these people want for the house, and set standards of design that would place the house on the property and have its height and massing so regulated that it would not negatively impact the garden. Now, that's the kind of thing that Preserve Mecklenburg can do, because we have the tremendous flexibility that we have in order to protect that garden. Now, that goes back. Look, folks, the tin cup is in hand. I tell you, there hadn't been anybody giving any money whatsoever to Preserve Mecklenburg. Zero. You know, all I can say is you can help us if you will go to preservemec.org/donate, or you can make a check payable to Preserve Mecklenburg and mail it to Preserve Mecklenburg, 1031 South Caldwell Street, Suite 200, Charlotte, NC 28203, and become a supporter of what we're trying to do, because we do very important work. So, Mary Dana, I wanted to talk to you about Elizabeth Lawrence, Elizabeth Clarkson, make you aware of this preservation issue, support Preserve Mecklenburg, and I hope everybody found this enjoyable.
I did. Thanks, Dad. Once again, we ran out of time. You always have a lot of things to talk about. Seems like sometimes we don't get to them. So next week you'll talk about some updates on projects. Is that your? Or are you going
Probably, and I might,
talk
Mary
more?
Dana, I have to be flexible about what I'm going to do, but I certainly will talk about the Patterson grocery store, bring people up to date on the McNinch project, and also the Knowlton Shaw House project, and we'll probably talk about Cedar Grove as well.
Okay.
Maybe might even talk about the Griffin.
Okay. Hey, you just talk about what you want to talk about.
Right.
Right. That's good.
Right.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you next week. Bye, Dad.
Bye, everybody. Say hello to Elizabeth Lawrence.